Well, welcome to Great Day Washington. We love our studio audience, so bright and cheery on this chilly Friday morning. But it's nice and warm in the Great Day Studios. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Marquette Shepard.
And I'm Kristen Bursett-Harris. So good for you to join us right before we get ready for the weekend. There is a long list of celebrities who quickly lost their jobs after allegations of sexual harassment. It's been in the news so much lately.
Every day something new is coming out, but in Washington it's been quite a different story when it comes to politicians who are elected officials.
So here to help us kind of sort through the difference between Hollywood, the media, and politicians in D.C. is Kimberly Whaley, professor at the University of Baltimore Law School and former assistant U.S. attorney. Kimberly, welcome.
Thank you.
I think with everything going on in the news, that's just, you see the Hollywood folks, the media folks get fired so quickly, but in politics, I mean, you still have a Roy Moore that's still running for election.
They're saying he can be elected and take a job in the Senate, and that's not the case for the private sector. So how do we make sense of this?
Sure. So in the private sector, there are bosses. There's somebody higher up the chain of command. We have viewers, we have customers, and the companies are concerned about their bottom line. So they move along if somebody's going to potentially hurt their profit margin. In the public sector, when you're talking about members of Congress, the boss is the voters ultimately under the Constitution, and it's a very attenuated process for canning them, so to speak. And whereas in the private sector, they can just, with a pink slip, off you go. And so we're seeing that distinction play out in real time right now.
So we know that that's like the frustration with the public is these men are still in office. Now we've seen Al Franken is going to resign, and then there are two others from Texas and Arizona, kind of from public pressure in a way. But what do we as citizens, what role can we play if we're unhappy with what's happening?
Well, first, of course, is to vote them out, but that's, you have to wait for the next election.
Right.
The second would be to call your members and say, listen, this is unacceptable. We want you to put pressure on your colleague, or if that is the actual person that's being charged, say, we think you should step down. The third piece, and this has been talked about with Roy Moore, if he ends up being elected, there is a provision in the Constitution for 2/3 of the chamber to expel a member for disorderly conduct. But that's difficult in that 2/3 is a lot of people, so you've got to really get everybody on board. And there's some ambiguity as to whether it has to be for misconduct in office. So for Roy Moore, the stuff that he's done is preceded his time in Congress, presumably, and so that might not work either. It's really difficult to legislate integrity and to legislate doing the right thing.
Well, the polls are saying that Roy Moore just might win the election in Alabama next week. For voters in Alabama and throughout the country who are not happy with that, if he is elected, what can we do besides wait for the next voting election?
Well, as I mentioned, pressure Congress to perhaps use this procedure for expelling him. My guess is he would put up quite a fight. So that's quite difficult. There is a lingering question of whether there'd be criminal liability. It depends on the statute of limitations that applies to him in Alabama. But that would require an appetite in Alabama, the prosecutors in Alabama, to want to do that, notwithstanding the will of the voters.
Well, Kimberly, I also read that if a member of Congress is sued, then they can use lawyers at the taxpayer's expense to fight their case, whereas an individual doesn't have the luxury of, hiring an attorney at taxpayers' expenses out of their own pockets. So it could just be a game of who has the deeper pockets, right? Sure.
So if the allegations come forward while he's in office, so by a staffer or someone that he engaged in some kind of inappropriate behavior, they would go to an office within Congress that Congress created. Takes 3 months to even lodge a complaint. As you mentioned, there's the congressperson's lawyer would be paid for. The complainant's lawyer would not. If there is a settlement, it would come out of taxpayer dollars, and it would be secret. So the process is really stacked against the victim, the alleged victim, and even if it gets to the end, it's really a slap on the wrist. So that process needs to change, and I think there is some effort in Congress to actually make it more transparent and more fair. So that's step one.
I think one thing as a citizen I want to know is, because you see with not just this issue but other issues, people writing their congressmen, writing letters, getting a bunch of signatures. Does that work? is that a waste of time on our part, or are they actually listening to what the citizens have to say?
You know, that's a great question. It's hard to say in general, issue by issue, it probably differs. I do think that is pure democracy, and that's what the framers of the Constitution intended it to work that way. That's how they wanted it to work, and that's why it's so hard to get rid of people once they're in office, because the idea is that we vote our own elected officials in, and they can't go out unless we say it's okay.
On both sides, it's very unsettling. Thank you so much for offering perspective this morning.
My pleasure.
Thank
Thanks
you,
for having
Kimberly.
me.